All right, this is the first lecture on the chapter on memory. These are the learning objectives. Kind of a theme throughout this chapter is that memory is a construction and it's not a recording. It's something that our brain has to build based on the information that it has and that it receives, the sensory information that it gets. We'll talk about different stages of memory, or different processes involved in memory, including the encoding and the retrieval we'll talk about later. But today we'll talk about encoding and storage and different kinds of memory, different regions of the brain that are involved in it. So there's a couple videos that I show as part of this lecture. I'll just post those links in the description. This is a case of a woman named Jill Price who is basically unable to forget, doesn't lose any episodic memories or memories of events in her life. So she can tell you what she was doing on a specific day. And in this video, she even corrects a history book because she remembers the date of an event and the book was wrong. So how do we define memory? This is the ability to store and retrieve information over time. The time varies depending on the type of memory. A very small percentage in most cases, unlike Jill Price, lasts for a very long time. A lot of our memory only lasts for a few seconds, but it's at least stored for some portion of time, and of course it's only useful if it can be retrieved. So there are three functions of memory, or three functions that fall under this process. There's the encoding. That's where we form a memory, we encode it. It gets entered into our nervous system. And then storage is the maintaining of that memory over time, and then retrieval is bringing to mind that information, accessing it. As I mentioned at the beginning, memories are constructed, they're not recorded. So these are a combination both of the sensory information that comes in, whether it's visual or auditory or whatever, and what we already have in our brains. So our current state of mind and previous experiences and the setting and the context in which we experience something is going to impact how a memory is formed. And memories are open to adjustment as well. So let's start with encoding. This is an activity that you could try on your own time, I guess, or maybe with your roommates or something. So if you organize words, if you put them in a random order, it's pretty hard to memorize very many of them in a short period of time. However, if you semantically, or if you organize them according to relationships, then it becomes easier. So this list on the left, those words are just kind of in a random order. However, book, warm, snake, skin, nude, violin, bow, arrow, target, etc., those kind of go more in an order of meaning, and there's a more logical flow between them. So that is a much easier list of words to memorize. And when I've done this activity in previous classes, the group that gets assigned the well-organized words always does better. Semantic encoding is where you have perhaps some random string of digits, for example, something that's not organized by meaning or relationships, but then you assign meaning on your own. So maybe you've heard of like the 1 bun, 2 shoe, 3 tree, 4 door mnemonic. You can use something like that to take like these random digits that you see here and assign a meaning to them, and maybe compose a weird story in your mind to help you remember 2 is shoe, 8 is gate. So you can imagine a shoe kicking open a gate. 6 is sticks. The gate is made of sticks, things like that. And memory experts, or people who are really good at memorizing random strings of digits, they use techniques like this. Here's kind of a similar method as that, but a little bit different. This is just a video. If you're interested in memorizing the first 101 digits of pi, this is a mnemonic for that. It's actually a song. So I'll post this link in the description as well. This is another method for encoding using visual imagery. So converting new information to mental pictures. One trick that you can use, and this is a study tip, you can do what's called or create what's called a memory palace in your mind. So if there's some list of people, for example, and maybe there's an order to them or some kind of organizational relationship between them, or even if they're just random, you can take a well-known or a visual that's well known to you, like the rooms in your apartment or in your house or your commute to work or something, and then you can put these different items, imagine them in these different spaces. So I attempted to use this technique to memorize my family tree back to my great-great-grandparents with some success. I haven't kept up with it too well, but kind of the technique that I would use is, for example, my great-grandpa Earl Mann Weiniger was an onion farmer, and so I imagined him in the backyard, and then I think his father was Clarence, and so I imagined Clarence from the movie It's a Wonderful Life out there digging onions or something. It helps to make things like this kind of unusual. These associations that you build, novel and unusual associations, are more likely to be remembered. So oftentimes these memory champions will use things that are pretty ridiculous because they're more likely to be remembered. Just so you know, these different types of encoding are going to activate different regions of the brain. One and this is not on the exam, but one example here that kind of draws on some information that you do know about from the neuroscience and behavior chapter is visual imagery encoding is going to activate the occipital lobe, which is involved in visual processing. So when you're forming new visual memories, you're going to see activation there. And even when you're imagining something, even if you're not seeing anything, but you're just imagining visual information in your mind, then the occipital lobe will also activate. This is a finding that aligns with an evolutionary perspective of memory encoding, that we're more likely to remember survival-related information. So here's some data from a study showing that if some information, like in a story, or if you're asked to memorize a list of items or things like that, things that are related to survival are more likely to be remembered. And that is also in part due to they often are associated with extensive planning and goal setting, and that's going to enhance encoding, but also would give an evolutionary advantage, making organisms that are better able to remember survival-related information more likely to survive and reproduce. So if, for example, you're having trouble memorizing which of these people does what, that might be a suggestion to use a memory palace, and maybe imagine, I don't know, Sigmund Freud in the basement, for example, down in the subconscious. Okay, this is just a little excerpt from an article in the New Yorker called "The Abyss," written by Oliver Sacks, who was a famous neurologist and did a lot of interesting research on anomalies in neuroscience and in psychiatry and neurology. So he writes about the case of a man named Clive, who started keeping a journal, and in his journal he would write statements like this: "I am awake," or "I am conscious," and then he would strike that out, and then a few minutes later he would write again, this time "properly awake," and then a few minutes later, this time "finally awake," and then again, this time "completely awake." At 9:40 p.m., I awoke for the first time despite my previous claims. This in turn was crossed out, followed by I was fully conscious at 10:35 p.m. and awake for the first time in many, many weeks. Sorry, I forgot to take that out. Of course, you can discuss this with your neighbor if you'd like. Normally, I do this in class if we were holding this in person. However, this is an interesting piece to his story. He finds some piano music and starts playing. Says, "Oh yeah, I've never, I never played any of them before." But then he started just playing one, and then he realizes that he can just play it, and even does a little bit of improvisation at the end. So Clive here doesn't remember really anything from his past. He thinks he's just barely waking up every few minutes of the day, but he still retained his musical abilities. So kind of pulling back the curtain about what happened here. So this is Clive Wearing. He was a musician, an English musician, and then there was an infection, a virus that specifically destroyed his hippocampus, and he was left with a devastating case of amnesia. So he had two kinds of amnesia, actually. Not only was he not able to form new memories, but he also lost his past. However, he's able to do a lot still. He can shave, shower, take care of himself, and his musical abilities, even conducting music, stayed intact. So cases like this, and here's his brain. You can see there's some parts missing here in the temporal lobes. So this is an MRI scan. Cases like this shed some light on how different regions of the brain play different roles in memory. So we talked about encoding. Now let's talk about storage. There are three types of storage: sensory memory, short-term, which overlaps with working memory, and then long-term memory. Sensory memory, this has a very high capacity, but it's only around for a hot second or five. So iconic and echoic memory. Iconic memories are visual information. So this is pretty much everything that you're seeing is going to leave a trace in your memory for just a few seconds. There's a small percentage of that makes it to the next phase. Same with auditory, and then in other domains as well. Visual and auditory are called iconic and echoic, respectively. I actually need to pause here. These videos are limited to 15 minutes, so I will do a part 2, and I'll continue there.